This is DW News live from Berlin. Tonight, are Israel and Hamas closer to a lasting ceasefire in Gaza? After talks in Egypt, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he's confident that a deal between Israel and Hamas is possible. He's adding that the gaps between the two are narrowing. Also coming up, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine. European Union leaders are meeting this week to decide what Europe can do about both. Plus, doctors in the U.S. performed the world's first pig-to-human kidney transplant. It's the latest experiment in a quest to use animal organs inside human beings. And Emmanuel Macron showing off his guns. Images of the French president working out with a punching bag. Well, they have sent much of France into a frenzy. I'm Brent Goff. To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. The gaps are narrowing. That is how U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is describing Israel and Hamas and the possibility of a ceasefire in Gaza. Blinken, who has been in Egypt for talks, says that Israel needs to do more to help increase the flow of aid into Gaza. He signaled some hope today, saying that he still believes a ceasefire agreement is possible. Blinken says that the gaps are narrowing between Israel and Hamas over the deal. Here's more of what Blinken had to say earlier on Thursday.
There's a clear consensus around a number of shared priorities. First, the need for an immediate, sustained ceasefire with the release of hostages. That would create space to surge more humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of many people and to build something more enduring. Now, the ceasefire that we're working on would be the best, most immediate way to enable us to surge humanitarian assistance, but it's not the only way. We agreed today, all of the ministers, that we would get our experts together in the coming days to identify the urgent, practical, and concrete steps that can and should be taken to increase the flow of assistance. Israel needs to do more.
So how much closer are we to an immediate, sustained ceasefire, as Blinken put it? I put that question to journalist Karim El-Gahari in Cairo.
Well, he said basically that is the main way forward. He said also that they're getting closer, but also admitting that there are still a lot of difficulties ahead. I think one of the best indications that there is something on the table that's worth negotiating is the fact that tomorrow, there will be a big meeting in Doha, in Qatar, also with the head of the Israeli Mossad intelligence service. So there seems to be enough to continue the negotiations, and Blinken seems to be quite optimistic that it will move forward.
Blinken also said that Israel needs to do more with aid deliveries to Gaza. It seems that the U.S. is now, I don't want to say on a full confrontation course with Netanyahu, but it could be described that way, and that pressure is building up. What would you say is behind this strategy?
Well, he clearly said that there is more aid coming in the last days, but he said it's by far not enough. And of course, that is a clear call towards the Israeli sides to finally open their borders to really get in massive amounts of aid. I think that what is behind it is really that we just heard it some days ago from the World Food Programme that is warning of an imminent famine in the Gaza Strip. And imminent famine is like there's certain indicators that are great of malnutrition among children, for example, how many children, food insecurity of the Gaza Strip, which Blinken also said in the press conference, is for 100% of the people in the Gaza Strip. So I think the U.S. doesn't want to be complicit any longer into the situation, and that's why they're pressuring for more aid to coming in. And it's an indication also that the negotiations, when Blinken comes to Israel tomorrow, will be quite tough if he wants to move forward on this.
Yeah, how much leverage do you think the U.S. has right now in trying to, push Israel in a certain direction? We know that Netanyahu has said that there is no alternative to a ground assault in Rafah.
Well, that's a question. Tough talk tomorrow in Israel probably will be not enough. It's a question, there's clear words now, or more clear words by the US side that there needs to be more aid coming in, that we need to have a ceasefire. The question is, how is the US acting on these talks? And we have at the same time, we have all this talk, but at the same time, of course, the biggest military assistance for Netanyahu in this Gaza war comes from the US. So there's a lot of leverage the US has, which he didn't use yet.
And we are hearing from the office of Benjamin Netanyahu that on Friday, Israel's spy chief, David Barnea, will travel to Qatar to secure a Gaza ceasefire that would include a hostage release. When you hear that, Karim, would you say that this indicates that things are moving, that we are looking at possible progress?
Yes, absolutely. But because we don't know the details, but we know also what the sticking points are. I think the main sticking point is basically there's an agreement that for a 6-week ceasefire and for the release of 40 Israeli hostages in exchange for the 20 to 30-fold number of Palestinians to be released from Israeli prisons. But there's a lot of sticking points. Then I think the main sticking point is that Hamas is saying we're going to continue to release hostages in a second phase, and that means also the soldiers. But we want to have guarantees for a permanent ceasefire and for an end of this war. And that is something, of course, very difficult to stomach for Netanyahu, because his announced objective in this war is the destruction of Hamas, which he would have not achieved in this case.
Journalist Karim El-Gahari from Cairo tonight with the latest. Karim, thank you. Leaders from across the European Union are meeting in Brussels, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is high on the agenda alongside Ukraine and plans to develop Europe's defense capabilities. EU leaders are also considering a proposal to buy armaments for Ukraine using the proceeds from frozen Russian assets, and whether or not to open membership talks with Bosnia-Herzegovina. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was at the summit today to encourage more relief for Gazans. The UN says a quarter of Gaza's population is starving. The EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, has described the situation in Gaza as being not a humanitarian crisis, but rather a failure of humanity. He says the EU leaders meeting in Brussels, who collectively formed the European Council, will be calling for the release of Israeli hostages as well as for a ceasefire that holds.
Today the Council goes much further, supporting UNRWA, asking for a sustainable ceasefire, certainly asking also for the freedom of hostages, needless to say condemning Hamas attack, but showing a strong concern for the situation of the people in Gaza, which is unacceptable. Certainly Israel has the right to defend, not to revenge, defend.
Our correspondent Jack Perrick is covering the summit for us. We asked him whether Joseph Borrell is speaking for all EU heads of government when he calls for a sustainable ceasefire.
Well, that is exactly what we're looking to see throughout the process of this summit, whether the EU leaders will agree for that progression. The last time we had any of the European Union leaders agreeing on some sort of call for a change in the situation of Israel's military campaign in the Gaza Strip against the Hamas terror organization, they called for humanitarian pauses to allow aid in. Our DW team here in Brussels has been covering and listening to a lot of the briefings from a lot of the different EU member states over the last few days. And going into this summit, we understand that the language coming out will say that the EU will call for immediate humanitarian pauses leading to a sustainable ceasefire. 5 or 6 months ago, the idea of calling for a ceasefire was an absolute no-go for the EU leaders, especially Germany, which didn't feel they could call for that. But we do understand that as this summit progresses, the EU leaders will be able to call for that sustainable ceasefire, that language will get into the document that comes out after this summit.
Ukraine's capital has been hit overnight by a massive Russian missile attack. This follows recent air attacks by Ukraine across the border in Russia's Belgorod region. The strike on Kyiv was the largest in recent weeks, causing casualties and damage to residential buildings.
In the early hours of Thursday, Kiev rocked by explosions. Scenes that people in the Ukrainian capital haven't seen in weeks.
The first explosion hit and I woke up, and a second later I was covering my daughter with my arms. There was a second explosion, and at that moment a piece of shrapnel hit my window. The children were sent to the bomb shelter and I wondered what to do next.
In the daylight, the aftermath of the attacks becomes visible. Blasts damage to residential buildings, with several people losing their homes.
If my son hadn't run out, he would have been killed. Our entire apartment was destroyed. The blast wave destroyed furniture, windows, doors, everything. It's a horror. Damn this war and Putin.
Ukraine's Air Force says it shot down all 31 Russian missiles targeting the capital on Thursday. But nearly 20 people were injured by their falling parts. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned the attacks as an act of terror. He has been relentless in his appeals to Western allies for air defense systems.
Our partners have these defense systems, and they need to understand that we need them to protect lives.
The strikes on Kiev follow a threat of retaliation from Russia's President Vladimir Putin. Ukraine has been pounding its Belgorod border region for several days, forcing evacuations of thousands of children. The exchange of attacks is yet another escalation in Russia's war against its neighbor.
All right, let's take a look now at some of the other stories that are making headlines around the world. The French Senate has voted overwhelmingly against a free trade deal between the EU and Canada. And it comes after President Macron's left and right-wing opponents joined forces to reject the agreement. The defeat comes after farmers across France railed against the EU's free trade policies during weeks of protests. The U.S. Department of Justice has sued tech giant Apple, alleging that the company is maintaining an illegal monopoly on the smartphone market. The sweeping lawsuit accuses Apple of using anti-competitive behavior to squeeze more money out of consumers and to hurt rivals. Apple has denied the charges and says it will defend itself. Yemens Houthi rebels have told China and Russia that their ships can pass through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea safely. The Houthis have been attacking vessels off the Yemeni coast since November. The U.S., Germany, and other countries have deployed their naval forces to protect shipping in this important trade lane. A proposed comeback for nuclear power around the world is being discussed here in Europe at talks in Brussels. The Nuclear Energy Summit is expected to call for Europe's nuclear industry to be rebuilt following years of decline. Nuclear power fell out of favor following Japan's Fukushima nuclear accident back in 2011. But commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions and the need to find alternatives to cheap Russian oil, they've all led to a rethink in how Europe should produce its energy. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen addressed the summit today, and she laid out her reasons for backing an increase in European nuclear power.
First of all, of course, to reach our climate goals. Let us not forget that nuclear power worldwide is the second largest source of low-emission electricity after hydropower. Second, of course, to safeguard our energy security. Countries look to reduce their dependence on imported fossil fuels. And the third reason is to ensure our competitiveness. Nuclear power can provide a reliable anchor for electricity prices.
Well, our Brussels correspondent Christine Mundwa told us more about the European leaders who now feel that they need more, not less, nuclear power.
Certainly a significant group. These countries include France, Belgium, Sweden, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Romania, and a few others. These countries say that there is a compelling case for nuclear energy because there's been significant progress, scientific progress, making nuclear much safer, much more reliable, as they put it, so much so that the Swedish Prime Minister, who was speaking at that same summit today, said that Sweden had reversed its decision to decommission its nuclear power plants. Belgium, as Prime Minister announced that the country, we've known this, but that the country was extending the lifespan of some of its younger nuclear power plants. These countries are saying that net zero is not possible without nuclear energy. And it is in the spirit of this that at COP28, these countries and the United States and others around the world signed a declaration to triple the amount of nuclear energy generation by the year 2050. So that's quite a huge undertaking. The challenge they're having in this space is mobilizing finance. And so a big part of this conference was about convincing your international finance institutions, your multilateral development banks, private sector stakeholders to lend, to finance nuclear power generation programs. So that was part of, like, a big part of what this summit is about. I have to point out also here, Phil, that there's this renewed momentum in the discussion around nuclear energy after the energy crisis that the world was plunged into after Russia invaded Ukraine. Suddenly, the idea of energy sovereignty, which you heard the commissioner there, the commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, sort of hinting at, really became much more at the forefront of the conversation about securing energy supply.
That was Christine Munwa there reporting from Brussels. In a medical first, surgeons in the United States have successfully transplanted a genetically modified pig kidney into a living human. A man with end-stage kidney disease was given the organ at a hospital in Boston last week. The organ was specially modified with the CRISPR gene editing technique to remove harmful pig genes and to add human ones to boost its compatibility. Until now, pig kidneys had only been temporarily transplanted into brain-dead patients. 2 men have also received pig hearts, but both died within months. Well, I'm joined now by Dr. Mike Curtis. He's the president and chief executive officer at eGenesis. He's responsible for managing the development of eGenesis's xenotransplantation programs in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's transplants between 2 species. Doctors, it's good to have you with us. Walk us through this. How do you make pig kidneys suitable for human transplantations?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for the interest in this story. So our approach is really to improve the compatibility of porcine organs with human recipients by making 3 different classes of changes to the porcine genome. The first group is to remove what we call antigens, or the molecules responsible for hyperacute rejection. We knock out the genes responsible for those antigens and basically eliminate hyperacute rejection. The next class of edits are we introduce human genes into the porcine genome. In this case, we introduced 7 to regulate coagulation compatibility and the mechanisms of rejection. And then the third group of edits are to inactivate endogenous retroviruses present in the porcine genome. And this is to improve organ safety and avoid the potential for disease transmission from the porcine donor to the patient. So in total, we created a total of 69 edits to the porcine genome to produce the donor that was used in this kidney transplant.
And the person who received the kidney transplant, how was this patient chosen? Because this is a first, and do we know how the patient's doing?
Yeah, so good question. And so this patient was a gentleman who had previously had a human kidney transplant that had failed. So he had this transplant for about 5 years. In the United States, if you've had a previous transplant and then you need a second transplant and you're over, say, 50 years old, it's unlikely that you're going to get a second transplant. So then you go on to dialysis. This particular patient was losing access to dialysis. So once he loses access to dialysis, he can't get a transplant. He would have to go into hospice and he would likely pass away. So this patient had run out of treatment options. And so he was chosen as a candidate for this first porcine kidney transplant. And as of today, he's doing incredibly well. The porcine kidney is being very well tolerated. He's producing urine. His markers of kidney function have improved, and he's on track to be discharged from the hospital.
Wow.
And so we're very pleased with his outcome, and we're so grateful for his willingness to participate in the study. And,
wow.
And so far, so good.
And will this patient, I'm thinking about other types of transplants with organs, will this patient have to take medication the rest of his life to prevent any type of rejection of the pig kidney?
Yeah, so he's on immunosuppression very similar to what any recipient of a human kidney would be on. Mm-hmm. Plus, we've added an additional immunosuppression drug that we refer to as a T-cell co-stimulation blocker from our partner Eledon Pharmaceuticals, is developing that to improve long-term outcomes and to reduce rejection. Mm-hmm. So he's on standard of care suppression plus this additional drug.
I mean, this sounds very promising, especially for people who are waiting for an organ transplant. I mean, I understand there are millions of people on waiting lists around the world. Is this a game changer in your opinion?
We believe it's the first step to a major change in how we treat kidney failure. In the United States alone, we're looking at about 600,000 patients on dialysis, about 90,000 patients on a transplant waiting list. The reality is all of those patients could use a kidney. In the U.S., we do about 25,000 kidney transplants a year, so way under the number that we need to do. So I do believe that this is the first step of changing that math completely.
Yeah, well, we certainly wish the patient well, and we appreciate you, Dr. Mike Curtis, for talking with us tonight. An exciting story. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the interest. Thanks.
Well, now here is the French president like you've probably never seen him before. These photos of Emmanuel Macron have been met with a mixture of praise and ridicule. The moody black and white shots were posted on Instagram by the president's official photographer. Some comments on social media suggest that they show the French president getting ready to take on Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, Philippe Marek is a professor emeritus in political communication at the Fontainebleau Institute of Political Studies in Paris. He says the photos have all the hallmarks of a French president trying to compete with a Russian president.
It seems there is a pattern of Emmanuel Macron wanting to address directly Putin and wanting to show that he wants to be the leader of, I would say, free Europe, if we would want to use these terms. And as you can see, he also wants to compete with him and to show that he has muscles. By the way, there is some criticism about the first picture because some people say has been retouched. So it's not anymore online.
What's been retouched, Professor? Do we know?
The muscles. It seems, I mean, they pretended that this is his real muscles, but it seems it's been retouched. It's not anymore online on the official website of the photographer.
Well, who is Macron addressing with these possibly, touched up muscles?
Well, there is a European election in a few months, and Emmanuel Macron has quite a low down in popularity. So he's trying to achieve something somewhere, and it seems the only place where he can achieve somewhere is as leader of the free world, or at least the free Europe, because at the moment school is not going very well in France. The reform is not very strongly accepted, and so the economics is going down. So it's a way to improve his popularity, at least he thinks.
Professor, what would you say distinguishes the images we've seen of Macron from the images of Vladimir Putin, those images that the world has seen? The Russian president, he has a history of presenting himself as a nature-loving, bare-chested athlete sitting on a horse in Siberia.
Indeed. But at the same time, you have to remember that with the personalization of political communication today, it's not a new thing in France. We have seen Nicolas Sarkozy a few years ago bicycling and running, sweating. And so, in fact, that's, I would say, a pattern of leaders who want to go on the populist side, I would say. And obviously, when you want to go against Putin, well, you try these things.
In a world where we talk about the metrosexual, we talk about feminist foreign policy, the male macho biceps bulging leader. Is that anachronistic? Is that political communication from the last century?
Well, I would say it comes more from the pattern of modern political communication, but I would say at the same time that it looks a little odd when you have the Me Too movement being so strong, especially in France now, where I would say a good part of the film business is now accused of being Me Too by the Me Too people. So it's a little odd, I would say.
And do you think there is a pattern here, or can we predict what politician will try to show their macho side? I mean, here in Germany, for example, many people could not imagine seeing similar photos from Chancellor Olaf Scholz, for example.
I know, but you remember, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. You can remember that, for instance, Schröder was shown when there were the floods in Dresden. He was shown with his boots and so on in the water. I would say it's a similar pattern. It depends on the circumstances.
Yeah. Well, it makes you wonder how these politicians have time to work out to get those muscles. Philippe Marek, Professor Emeritus of Political Communication. Professor, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And finally, I bet they don't offer a pachyderm pedicure in your local nail salon, but they do at a zoo here in Germany. That's where elephants at the Cologne Zoo have been getting their annual, that's right, pedicures. The treatment is part of the animal's regular medical checkups. The procedure differs only a little from the typical salon experience that you and I would know, with the zookeepers using an angle grinder to buff up the slightly larger toenails. Those are some big toenails. Yeah. Here's a reminder now of our top story. After talks in Egypt, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that he believes the gaps are narrowing between Israel and Hamas over a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Blinken says that Washington is working to identify concrete steps that can be taken to increase the flow of aid into Gaza.